The story you're about to hear is one of the more dramatic I have heard. And my guest, Dr. Richard Harris, as I introduced briefly on the other side of the break before he is about to join us now, as I introduced him before, he's gone from one radical extreme of destruction and hate to the radical extreme of God's love as much as anyone you're going to hear. Richard, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Dr. Brown. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, just to make sure I have this right, you ran the largest underground terrorist organization in the Midwest during the mid to late 1970s. This is an accurate quote?
Yes.
All right. Tell us about your upbringing. Tell us how your ideology got shaped, and then let's find out about your journey.
Sure. I grew up upper middle class family, intact family, father, mother, two older brothers. But I was the one that the schoolyard bullies always picked on in elementary school. I was one they took the lunch money away from on the playground. And I grew up very, very angry. It was a segregated school. And then in sixth grade in the school, desegregation happened in the 1960s. And all of a sudden, I started seeing African-American children being bussed into my formerly all-white school, and I realized that they were being bussed in from the other side of town. They were coming onto my turf. This was where I had been going to school for the last 5 years, and now they were brand new. And I as this angry, bullied child, I wanted to get back at somebody, and I didn't know how or who or when, but this provided the opportunity because obviously they were in the minority in the school, and so I started picking on them, and I started bullying them so badly that by eighth grade, my eighth grade yearbook, I still have it. Someone actually wrote in there to Richard Harris, Grand Dragon of the KKK, keep those inward in line. So I was well known as.
And how old were you at this point?
Eighth grade.
Wow.
So 13.
Incredible. All right. So what happens from there?
My mother passed away when I was 14, and that caused my father to have to run two businesses, and so he was hardly around. He was trying to keep both businesses up and going, and I rarely ever saw him. And my two older brothers, they were much older than me. One was already a doctor and married and away from the house. The other one was in college. So I was coming home. I was this upper middle class, white, latchkey kid who didn't have a lot of friends and had a lot of time on his hands. And by the time I was 16, when I was 16, well, the Klan had been watching me. I did not know it, but they had been watching me in my middle school years because there were a couple of teachers in my middle school who were active Klans people. Obviously, no one knew about it. It was a secret. But they were watching me, and so when I turned 16, the age that you could become a member of the regular adult Klan, they started wooing me into the organization, and they would come to me and they would say things like, if you joined us, no one would ever pick on you, no one would ever call you names, no one would ever make fun of you, no one would bully you anymore. We'll take care of you. And we'll be your mother, and we'll be your father, and we'll be your brothers and sisters. We'll be a family. And that sounded really good to this lonely 16-year-old.
And let me ask you this. The KKK, I have no exposure to it, no connection to it. Growing up as a Jewish kid in New York City and Long Island, different part of the world, different culture, then coming to faith in godly circles, completely unattached to some of this Southern or Midwestern racist, quote, Christianity. Who was the KKK? What was their message? What did they represent?
The Klan believed in white supremacy, as they still do. The Klan believes that they are the true Christians, that they are the ones who are really shining the light for the white race, and the white race, we are the chosen ones. and everyone else, if you're not from white European descent, then you are an inferior being. Some of the Klan groups would go so far as to say that only whites were actually human. Others were simply animals and less than human. And so their message is that they want to take back this nation, keep it segregated, and possibly even make it an all-white nation only, with no minorities, or at least keep the minorities segregated over into one section.
And in a community like that where you grew up, Richard, how prevalent was the KKK? Obviously, you can't give exact figures, but was it just something that behind the scenes people knew, hiding here and there, or was it just, lots of us are KKK?
Indiana is the largest Klan state north of the Mason-Dixon line. At least it was in the 1970s. It was a very huge Klan state, and I happened to grow up in Kokomo, Indiana, which was where the state headquarters was located. So there was a lot of Klan members. They were everywhere, but of course it's a secret organization. You did not know most of these people were actually in the Klan because they were your business people, they were your store owners, they were doctors, they were lawyers, they were police officers, they were teachers.
And how many of them were openly and outwardly racist, even though you didn't know openly that they were in the Klan?
Many of them would not, by day, appear unusually racist for that time and age, but at night they would be going to secret Klan meetings and they would be espousing their true beliefs. Many of them were just the average white person, but you got to remember that back in the 1960s, society was just a very much different than it is today. I grew up in a home where the N-word was just a regular word, and you said it, and no one thought anything about it, whereas you would not say those things today. So there was a lot of racism, but as far as I never heard my parents talk about black people, but then again, they never had any friends. No one of a minority had ever entered our home, to my knowledge, and nor would they be welcome. And I certainly picked up on that and knew that, even though they never sat me down and said, okay, we have a lesson for you, son.
And just 30 seconds before the break, but your interaction with other kids in school, I mean, did you ever in that setting begin to interact with black kids and see their humanity?
Honestly, no. The black kids in school, and this was true even for high school as well, they usually kept to themselves, and we usually kept to ourselves. They had their place in the lunchroom. We had our place in the lunchroom, and there was as little interaction as possible.
All right, friends, we'll be right back. I'm eager to hear more of this story, how God takes someone like that full of hatred, that's full of bigotry, that's full of prejudice, and we didn't even get to the worst of his activities yet, and turns him into a man with a message of love and reconciliation. Stay right here. From Grand Dragon in the Ku Klux Klan to leading a multiracial congregation, that's the kind of thing that Jesus does. I'm speaking to Dr. Richard Harris. So, Richard, just a quick question, purely out of curiosity, and we don't need to take much time on this at all. But these names, Grand Dragon and Grand Wizard, for an ostensibly Christian group, where in the world does this stuff come from?
Actually, those names go clear back to the founding of the Klan. They started using odd names like that, and then I believe they finally codified them around the turn of the century, and they simply came came into being because they wanted to create an era an aura of mysticism and that kind of thing for their members, and hence also the robes, the outfits that we wore were really just to separate them from other people, to make people feel like you're really a part of something.
And how long were you in the Klan?
I was in the Klan for about 4 years.
All right. And during that time, now this may be difficult for you to say in retrospect because you didn't really know the Lord then, but did there seem to be any folks that genuinely believed in the gospel but were deeply deceived and confused, or was it people who were purely Christian in name only and using their Christianity as a cloak for their hatred?
You know, I think there was both. I think both was happening, even in the same individuals. Oftentimes, very deceived, but yet at the same time, really, honestly, there were those who were very religious and very sincere, and then there were those of us like myself who I was Christian in name only because I was brought up in a Christian. And so, of course I was Christian.
All right, so you're in the Klan. How do you get from there to outright terrorism?
That was rather interesting because the Klan had been grooming me from the moment that I became a member, and I didn't even realize what they were grooming me for. I just thought that I was getting the same treatment that everyone else was. But they had been watching me, and they realized that I was a very good public speaker. I was young. I was very intelligent. And they said this guy could be groomed for leadership. So that's what they're always looking for. They're looking for someone who is a good public speaker, who can communicate well, and who basically can stir up and rally the troops together. And so when they saw that, they started grooming me, and I was made the Grand Dragon of Indiana 2 years after I joined. And I was the second youngest Grand Dragon in the nation, and I became Grand Dragon and ran Indiana when I was 18 years old.
18 years old, extraordinary. And for everyone listening, friends, this did not just go back to race issues. This went back to family issues. This went back to being bullied as a kid. There's so many things that can happen, and it's easy to radicalize someone. That's why so many people are radicalized into all kinds of causes while in prison, and they're vulnerable to want to fight against, quote, the system. So, Richard, as the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan in Indiana, what type of activities did you conduct? What were you involved in?
I was mostly involved with making appearances, public speaking, and also writing a lot of the propaganda and producing a lot of the propaganda that they would use to hand out, planning rallies, planning these marches that you see even today, and like we saw just over the weekend. That was a lot of what I was involved in. One of the things the Klan learned from the very turbulent 60s during the civil rights era, a lot of Klansmen ended up going to jail for carrying out violent activities. One of the things they learned was that they needed to keep their leaders out of jail because their leaders didn't do much good when they were in jail. So because they were grooming me for leadership, they purposely kept me away and ignorant of a lot of the violence that was going on around me, being perpetuated by just some of the lower level Klans people. But I knew that a lot of it was going on, even though I didn't know the details. All I had to do was walk through state headquarters and simply say, boy, that Mr. Jones over on Boulevard Street really makes me angry. That's all I needed to do. I didn't have to give an order. I didn't have to bring people in. All I had to do was express that, and I knew that something would be done to Mr. Jones. It may not be for a month or a year. They kept very long lists, but sometime something was going to be done, and it would not be reported back to me or anything, because that would that would make me part of it. And so they were able to do that. They got very smart about keeping their leaders away from actually doing illegal activities themselves.
And if you could summarize, as ugly and unpleasant as this is, just in the minute and a half before the break, the type of propaganda you'd put out, the message you'd get out, summarize it. What was this message that you were preaching and that you were so good at articulating?
It was always focused around white people are superior to blacks, to Hispanics, to Jewish people. Always, they were the inferior ones. And we would literally sit around and make up studies. A Harvard study done in 1964 showed that African American brains are 30% smaller than European brains. We would make that up. It would be sent off to the printers. It would be printed up. It would look very real, and it would sound very real. We literally made it up.
Incredible. Fake news going back.
Yes, absolutely.
Extraordinary. All right, listen, friends, we've heard how deep Dr. Harris was caught up in this hatred, in this bigotry, and as a professing Christian on top of it. We come back, we're going to hear how Jesus got hold of him and how the Lord is using him to this day. Boy, this is a message we need to get out in this day and in this age.
Change the world. Change the world.
Welcome back to the Line of Fire. Jesus brings us into right relationship with God through the blood of the cross, and into right relationship with one another through the blood of the cross. Speaking again with Dr. Richard Harris, former Grand Dragon of the KKK in Indiana, now a man leading the way in racial reconciliation through the gospel. All right, Richard, what happens next? How in the world does God get hold of a bigoted, hate-filled young person like you?
All right. So I was Grand Dragon I had been Dragon for a couple of years. I'm 20 years old now, and I have 4 armed bodyguards who are there to protect me. I hear through the grapevine that one of my 4 armed bodyguards has put a hit out on me and is going to take me out. And so I couldn't prove it, but I believed it. In my mind, I thought, I need different security. I need different protection. I need more protection. So I thought the only way I could do that is if I had a higher office. I contacted the Imperial Wizard. Now, the Imperial Wizard is the man who's in charge of the entire nation. I called him up on the phone, and I said, Bill, I want a national office. I've done a great job in the Indiana Klan running it. I said, I've started the youth Klan. I actually started recruiting for the youth Klan clear down into the elementary grades. And the Klan had grown under me. And he said, well, yes, you're absolutely right. He says, I do think you're ready for a national office, but the only one we've got coming available is the national chaplain of the Klan.
So there's
I said, I don't know anything about being a preacher. And he says, you're a good public speaker. All you have to do, start reading the Bible, start pulling out some good-sounding scripture verses, and put them in your speeches, start sounding religious, and I'll take care of the rest. And I said, well, that sounds like a plan to me. So I started reading my Bible that very night. Now, I didn't know where to turn in the Bible. I didn't know one book from the Bible from the other book from the Bible. I had no idea. I should have started in the book of Genesis, I guess, but I didn't. I realize now it was God guiding me. I started reading the Gospel of John. And as I was reading that, I thought, oh, this is great. These are the stories of Jesus. I'll just find some good things Jesus said, and I'll quote Jesus. Can't sound too much more religious than Jesus. And so I'm reading along in the Gospel of John. Everything's fine until I get to John chapter 4. John chapter 4 is the Samaritan woman at the well story. And it was one of the Klan's favorite stories to tell, because every Klan meeting is started with a Klan preacher, because they really do believe that they are the true Christians. And so a Klan preacher would open up the Klan meeting with a prayer, with a scripture, sometimes with a sermon. And I had heard Klan preachers preach on the Samaritan woman at the well story several times. So I was familiar with it. I said, oh, I know this story. And I knew what a Samaritan was because the Klan had taught me that one correctly, half Jewish, half Gentile. So I knew what that was, or as the Klan would call them, race mixers, half-breeds. And so I'm reading down through, and I get to the point where the Samaritan woman asked Jesus for a drink, or Jesus rather asks the Samaritan woman for a drink, and the Samaritan woman says, why do you ask me for a drink? You are a Jew, I am a Samaritan. And then the Bible says that Jews don't have anything to do with Samaritans. At that point, the Klan chaplains would close their Bibles and start preaching. That was the end of the story.
I tell you what, I'm interrupting the story here. We'll come back on the other side and find out what happens when Dr. Richard Harris keeps reading what happens in the Gospel of John. Wow. Welcome back, friends, to The Line of Fire. 866-348-7884. That is the number to call if you've got any questions or comments, but we're taking all our time right now with our special guest, Dr. Richard Harris. All right, you're a KKK member. You're going to be national chaplain for the Klan. You're now reading the Gospel of John, a favorite story. Jews have nothing to do with Samaritans, so whites, we superior ones, have nothing to do with those inferior blacks. That's the hateful narrative you've been fed, and now you keep reading in John 4.
I keep reading because for the first time I'm reading the Bible for myself, and I realize, wait, that's not the end of the story, because the Klan chaplains would stop at that. Jews don't have anything to do with Samaritans, half-breeds, race mixers. And they would say, well, we're smarter than Jews, aren't we? And, of course, the answer was always, well, yes, of course we are. I had only met one Jewish person in my entire life at that point. And they said, well, we know better than Jews. If Jews don't have anything to do with race mixing, well, we don't have anything to do with that either. The Samaritan woman at the well story shows us that Jesus hates race mixing. That was the Klan's line. And but now I'm reading it for myself, and I went, wait, that's not the end of the story. There's more to it. What is this? And I keep reading. I read that story, and I realized that this race-mixing Samaritan woman, she became a believer in Jesus, and Jesus accepted her, and he loved her. And then she goes back to the town. She brings a whole town full of half-breeds, and they become believers in Jesus, and Jesus loves them too and accepts them. The story of the Samaritan woman at the well was Jesus loves race mixers. And that's when the light bulb came on. I mean, I wasn't stupid. It was like, this is obviously the Klan has lied to me. And it wasn't just one Klan chaplain I'd heard preach on that particular passage. I'd heard several over the years, and they all said the same thing. I read the Gospel of John. I kept reading that night. I stayed up all night long. I read the entire Gospel of John. I kept finding place after place after place where the Klan had just slightly twisted the Scriptures, sometimes just absolutely taught the wrong thing, the exact opposite of what the Scriptures was teaching. And by the time I got done with the Gospel of John that night, I knew that I had to get out. The Klan had lied to me. They were not the true Christians. like I thought they really were. And I didn't know how to pray. I prayed a very simple prayer. God, if there's any way that you can get me out of this alive, I want to find out what a true Christian is, and I want to be one. And I called the Imperial Wizard up the very next day, and I quit the Klan.
Whoa. Okay. So one thing you're telling us is that very few of these people actually seriously read the Bible. Otherwise, they would have seen the deception and then had to make a choice. And obviously, if they stayed the Klan, they weren't going to be serious with God and the Scripture. You had this radical conversion. I wish I could get into even more details, but our time is short. I want to make sure we go on with what's happened since in the ministry you're doing today. But just very quickly, were there repercussions? Were there threats against you?
Well, absolutely. There were. I mean, they put a gun to my head, and they said, you keep your mouth shut, or you know what's going to happen to you. Well, I knew exactly what that meant. And I did keep my mouth shut for about 15 years until finally I realized that God really needed me to wanted me to tell people, and hopefully keep others from following the same path that I did. So once I started speaking out against the Klan really turned against me and became my enemies. And so they've been out to get me ever since.
All right, so what have you now given yourself to in terms of the right message and modeling what Jesus is about?
Well, you know, when I preach now, I not only obviously speak out against the Klan and neo-Nazis and other white supremacist groups, because we obviously, I hope it's obvious to your readers that they are in the wrong. But it's not just that. Racism, you know, so many times we in the white church have thought that, well, we're not Klan, we're not Nazi, so therefore we're not racist, so we don't have a problem with it. But racism, it's not quite that black and white, if you'll excuse the pun. Racism is on a continuum, and you may not be at the extreme end like these people are, but you're somewhere on that continuum, and we have to ask ourselves, how many friends, real friends, do we have that we actually invite over to our house and we do things with and we go on vacation with? How many friends do we have that are of different races than us? And the majority of white people do not have those kinds of friendships that they can point to, and that's the way that we get to understand each other and communicate with each other when we start having real friendships, not associates at work or at school. And, well, you know, I see them, I say hi to them, we treat each other decent. But no, I'm talking about building real bridges and real friendships.
Yeah, that is quite a challenge, and something that exposes not necessarily racism, but lack of shared life experience. And, you know, Richard, just being on live radio for 8-9 years, the many calls that I got from African-American listeners gave me perspectives that I never had my entire life, even with all my interacting with black Christian friends, because they tended to be in a certain political or social or spiritual place that we had even more in harmony. And many of my listeners loved the Lord, but had very different perspectives on things or different life experiences. And it really helped expand some of my thinking, because I'm constantly listening and learning and trying to see, where do I have a blind spot, culturally, background, whatever it is. So this is a great question for us to ask ourselves. What have you now been able to do, not just in bringing that challenge, but in constructive steps to help minorities, to bring about reconciliation?
One of the things that has happened in my life within the last couple of years is an African-American pastor, senior pastor of a large African-American church in the area. He came and he heard me speak, and I was challenging the ministerial leaders in the group It was put on by the Chamber of Commerce and all. There's a lot of business leaders, but I was challenging particularly the religious leaders. So, if you really want to build multicultural bridges, if you want to build a multicultural church and really reach out and begin to develop these friendships and this communication, then when people of a different color than what you are come into your church, they better see multiculturalism. They better see different colors up there on the platform, in the leadership. Because if they don't see someone in the leadership like them, they're very unlikely to return to your church. Mm-hmm. And at the time, I had just stepped down from being a senior pastor, pastoring for 31 years, and I was simply at the university teaching. And an African-American senior pastor came up to me and he said, "It's time to put your money where your mouth is. I know you're not pastoring. Come join my staff and be one of my associate pastors." He says, "Because I have a historic African-American church that I would love to see begin to reach out to other races and do exactly what you said." And so, of course, my African-American congregation, they absolutely love going around telling you would not believe who we have on our platform.
Oh, come on.
To us in our pulpit.
Come on. And I bet that you would even have more joy from the African-American congregation to have someone like you on the pastoral staff than an all-white congregation to have a former Black Panther on their pastoral staff. I think there's a greater embrace and a greater celebration simply because of history. And Richard, if folks want to find out more about your work, but I mean the ultimate story to associate from Grand Dragon of the KKK to associate pastor at an African American church, that's God. That's got to bring you great joy every day. But if they want to go to a website or a book you've written, what's the best thing to go to or place to go?
They can check out my website. It's always in progress, as all of them are, but it's harrisspeaks.com, HARRIS, harrisspeaks.com. And also they can pick up a copy of my book off of Amazon. It's One Nation Under Curse. One Nation Under Curse.
All right, One Nation Under Curse, the name of the book by Dr. Richard Harris. His website, harrisspeaks.com. Brother, thank you for sharing an incredible story with us today. God bless you.
Thank you, Dr. Brown.